The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 1,000th time. At 42 years old, he had been a member of the Queen's Guard for nearly 2 decades, standing sentinel with the kind of discipline that had become second nature. His black bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. Thomas had seen 3 generations of the royal family pass by during his watch. He had stood motionless through rain, snow, and blazing summer heat. Tourists would often try to make him laugh. Children would wave enthusiastically, and photographers would snap countless pictures, but Thomas remained as still as a statue. It was his duty, his honor, and for the longest time his purpose. On this particular Tuesday morning, the castle was preparing for a routine day. The staff moved about their duties with practiced efficiency, and the guards took their positions with the same precision they had maintained for centuries. Thomas had been assigned to the main entrance, a position he knew well. From here he could see the comings and goings of the royal household while maintaining his stoic composure. The sound of children's laughter echoed from within the castle walls. Prince George, now 11 years old, was home from school due to a minor illness that had kept him from his regular classes. The young prince had always been curious about the world around him, often watching the guards from his bedroom window with fascination. Unlike his younger siblings, George had developed a particular interest in the traditions and ceremonies that surrounded his family's life. Thomas had noticed the boy's attention before. Sometimes when the prince walked past with his nanny or parents, Thomas would catch a glimpse of those bright, intelligent eyes studying the guards with genuine interest, rather than the casual indifference that wealth and privilege often bred. There was something different about this child, something that reminded Thomas of his own son, whom he rarely saw due to the demanding nature of his position. The morning progressed normally until around 10:30, when Thomas heard the familiar sound of small footsteps approaching. Prince George appeared around the corner, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, looking much like any other 11-year-old boy except for the unmistakable bearing that came with his royal upbringing. He was alone, which was unusual, though Thomas knew that within the castle walls, the prince was generally safe to move about freely. George approached slowly, his eyes fixed on Thomas with that same intense curiosity. The boy stopped about 5 feet away, close enough to be noticed but respectful of the formal distance that protocol demanded. Thomas remained perfectly still as he had been trained, but he was acutely aware of the young prince's presence. What happened next would forever change Thomas's perspective on his role and his life. Prince George didn't try to make him laugh or break his composure like so many others had attempted. Instead, the boy simply stood there studying Thomas's face with an expression that seemed far too mature for his age. There was no mischief in his eyes, no attempt at humor. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like understanding. After several minutes of this silent observation, Prince George did something unexpected. He took a small step forward and in a voice barely above a whisper said, "Thank you for protecting us. I know it must be hard to stand so still for so long." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Thomas felt deep in his chest. The boy's eyes held a sincerity that was startling. Here was a child who could have anything he wanted, who lived in palaces and would one day inherit a throne, yet he was expressing genuine gratitude to a guard, not the performative thanks that adults often offered, but something real and heartfelt. Thomas, bound by duty and protocol, could not respond. He could not even acknowledge that he had heard the words. But inside something shifted. In 20 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever spoken to him with such personal recognition of his sacrifice. He had received commendations, awards, and formal acknowledgments, but never this kind of simple human appreciation. Prince George seemed to understand that Thomas couldn't respond. The boy nodded slightly as if accepting this limitation, and then did something even more remarkable. He stepped back to his original position and stood perfectly still himself, mimicking Thomas's posture. For the next 10 minutes, the 11-year-old prince stood guard alongside the experienced soldier, both facing forward, both maintaining the discipline that the position required. During those 10 minutes, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just respect for his duty or pride in his uniform. It was a connection to another human being who seemed to truly understand the weight of service even at such a young age. The boy's gesture was silent but profound, acknowledging not just Thomas's role but his humanity. When Prince George finally walked away, he turned back once and offered the smallest of nods. Not the casual acknowledgement of a superior to a subordinate, but the respectful recognition of one person of service to another. Thomas remained at his post, but the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his position had been quietly shaken. That evening, as Thomas returned to his small apartment off base, he found himself thinking not about the routine aspects of his day, but about those 10 minutes when a young prince had chosen to stand beside him in solidarity. It was a gesture that would plant a seed of change that would grow in ways neither the guard nor the prince could have anticipated. The days following Prince George's unexpected gesture brought an unusual restlessness to Thomas Mitchell's normally ordered life. He found himself replaying those 10 minutes over and over, analyzing every detail of the young prince's behavior and his own internal response. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams where he was no longer wearing the iconic red tunic but standing beside the prince as an equal, both of them protecting something precious together. Thomas had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize his emotions. A good guard was like a well-oiled machine, performing his duties without the messy complications of personal feelings. Yet Prince George's simple words of gratitude and that silent moment of solidarity had awakened something that Thomas had been suppressing for years, a growing sense of isolation and disconnection from the life he was supposedly protecting. During his next shift, Thomas found himself more aware of his surroundings than usual. He noticed things that had become invisible through routine, the way tourists looked at him as if he were part of the architecture, rather than a living person, the casual manner in which staff members passed by without acknowledgement, the distance that his role created between him and the world around him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his bearskin hat not as a symbol of honor, but as a barrier that separated him from authentic human connection. The other guards began to notice subtle changes in Thomas's demeanor. His posture remained perfect, his discipline unwavering, but there was something different in his eyes. Corporal James Harrison, who had served alongside Thomas for 8 years, mentioned during their brief break that Thomas seemed distracted. "You're thinking too much, mate," James said with concern. "That's dangerous in our line of work." But Thomas couldn't stop thinking. Prince George's gesture had opened a door in his mind that he couldn't close. He began to remember his son Michael, now 16, whom he had missed watching grow up because of his commitment to the guard. He thought about his ex-wife Sarah, who had left him 5 years earlier, unable to compete with what she called his love affair with duty. He reflected on friendships that had withered because he could never be fully present, always mentally preparing for his next shift, always maintaining the emotional distance that his role required. The following week brought another encounter that would deepen Thomas's internal conflict. Prince George appeared again during the morning shift, this time accompanied by his younger sister, Princess Charlotte. The 9-year-old princess was chattering excitedly about something she had learned in her lessons, but George's attention was focused on Thomas. When they reached the guard's position, George gently guided his sister to stop. "Charlotte," George said quietly, "do you see how still he stands? He's been protecting our family for many years." The princess looked up at Thomas with new interest, her young face serious with concentration. She seemed to be trying to understand the significance that her brother was pointing out to her. Then George did something that made Thomas's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The young prince reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Without saying a word, he placed it on the ground near Thomas's feet, far enough away to avoid any breach of protocol but close enough that Thomas could see it clearly. The paper had something drawn on it in crayon, a picture of a guard in his red uniform standing beside a small figure that was clearly meant to be Prince George himself. "I drew this after we stood together last week," George whispered, his voice barely audible. "I wanted you to know that I remember." He paused, then added with the wisdom of someone far beyond his years, "Sometimes the most important people are the ones we see every day but never really notice." Princess Charlotte, following her brother's lead, gave Thomas a solemn curtsy before the two children continued on their way. Thomas remained motionless, but his eyes were fixed on the small drawing at his feet. In those simple crayon strokes, he saw recognition of his humanity that had been absent from his life for far too long. That evening, after his shift ended, Thomas carefully picked up the drawing and took it home. He sat in his small kitchen, studying the childish artwork under the harsh fluorescent light. The figure of the guard in the drawing stood tall and proud, but what struck Thomas most was the smile on the crayon guard's face. He couldn't remember the last time he had genuinely smiled while on duty. He thought about his son Michael, who had once drawn similar pictures when he was young, stick figures of father and son playing football, going fishing, doing all the things that Thomas had promised they would do when he had more time. But time had passed, and those promised moments had been sacrificed to duty, until eventually Michael stopped asking and started pulling away. Thomas pulled out his phone and stared at his son's contact information. They hadn't spoken in over 2 months, their last conversation brief and strained. Michael had called to tell him about making the school football team, but Thomas had been preparing for an important ceremony and hadn't given the news the attention it deserved. The call had ended with mutual disappointment and the familiar promise to talk soon that both of them knew was unlikely to happen. As he sat there holding Prince George's drawing, Thomas began to question everything he had built his adult life around. He had believed that his service to the crown was the highest calling he could answer, that the sacrifice of his personal relationships was a noble price to pay for the honor of protecting the royal family. But a child's simple gesture of appreciation had revealed the hollowness at the center of his dedication. He began to imagine what it might be like to have a different kind of relationship, with duty, one that didn't require him to become invisible, that allowed him to be acknowledged as a complete human being, rather than just a uniform and a function. For the first time in decades, Thomas allowed himself to consider the possibility that there might be other ways to serve, other paths that wouldn't require him to sacrifice his connections to the people he loved. The drawing remained on his kitchen table as he prepared for bed, but sleep brought no peace. Instead, Thomas found himself caught between two worlds, the familiar realm of duty and protocol that had defined him for 20 years, and a new possibility that Prince George's gesture had revealed. A world where service could coexist with humanity, where protection could be offered without the complete erasure of self. 3 weeks had passed since Prince George left the drawing, and Thomas Mitchell found himself fighting an internal battle that grew more intense with each passing day. The small piece of paper with its innocent crayon marks had become both a source of comfort and a symbol of everything he felt he was losing. He had pinned it to the wall beside his bed, where it was the first thing he saw each morning and the last thing he glimpsed before sleep. The change in Thomas was becoming impossible to hide. During formation inspections, Sergeant Major Williams noticed that Thomas's attention seemed divided. His responses were still crisp and professional, but there was a hesitation, a moment of internal debate before each answer that hadn't been there before. The precision that had made Thomas a model guard was beginning to show tiny cracks. "Mitchell," Sergeant Major Williams called after morning inspection. "A word, if you please." The older man's weathered face showed concern rather than anger. Williams had been with the Guard for 30 years and had seen good soldiers struggle with the unique pressures of their role. "Is everything all right at home?" Thomas straightened his shoulders, falling back on the automatic responses that had served him well for 2 decades. "Yes, sir. Everything is in order." But even as he spoke the words, he felt their emptiness. Nothing was in order. His entire understanding of what he was doing and why had been shaken by an 11-year-old boy's simple act of recognition. "I've been watching you." "Thomas," Williams continued, using his first name to signal that this conversation was more personal than official. "You're one of my best men, but something's changed. You're present but not present, if you understand my meaning." Williams paused, studying Thomas's face carefully. "In this job, distraction can be dangerous. Not just for you, but for those we're sworn to protect." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. The idea that his internal struggle might compromise his ability to protect the royal family was sobering. Yet at the same time, he found himself wondering whether his current state of mind might actually make him more effective, more aware of the human elements of his duty rather than just the mechanical aspects. "I understand, sir," Thomas replied, though he wasn't sure he understood anything anymore. "I'll refocus," but refocusing proved impossible. That afternoon, while stationed at the south entrance, Thomas witnessed something that further complicated his already turbulent thoughts. Prince George appeared again, this time with his father, Prince William. The young prince was animatedly describing something about his school project, gesturing enthusiastically as they walked. When they passed Thomas's position, George briefly met his eyes and offered the smallest of smiles. Not the formal acknowledgement of a royal to a servant, but the warm recognition of one friend to another. Prince William noticed his son's gesture and followed his gaze to Thomas. For a moment, the future king studied the guard with the same intensity that his son had shown weeks earlier. There was something in Prince William's expression that suggested he was aware of some interaction between his son and the guard, though the exact nature remained unclear. "George has mentioned you in conversation," Prince William said quietly, stopping near Thomas's position. "He's quite observant for his age, and he seems to have developed a respect for the work you do." The prince paused, then added, "I wanted you to know that your service hasn't gone unnoticed, not just by the institution, but by the people you protect." Thomas remained at attention, unable to respond, but Prince William's words echoed Prince George's earlier gesture of recognition. Here was another member of the royal family acknowledging his humanity, rather than just his function. The moment was brief, but it left Thomas with even more to contemplate. That evening, Thomas did something he hadn't done in months. He called his son, Michael. The phone rang several times before the teenager answered, his voice cautious and slightly surprised. "Dad, is everything okay?" Michael's first instinct was to assume something was wrong, which told Thomas more about their relationship than he cared to acknowledge. "Everything's fine," Thomas said, though that wasn't entirely true. "I just wanted to talk. How's the football team going?" The conversation that followed was stilted at first, both of them navigating the unfamiliar territory of casual conversation. But gradually, Michael began to open up about his life, his friends, his classes, his hopes for making varsity next year. Thomas found himself genuinely listening, asking questions that weren't just polite but reflected real interest in his son's world. "Dad," Michael said near the end of their conversation, "you sound different. More like yourself, if that makes sense." The observation stung because Thomas realized he couldn't remember the last time he had felt like himself, rather than like a uniform with a person inside it. "I've been thinking about some things," he admitted. "About what's important. Maybe we could do something together soon." Michael's voice carried a hope that Thomas hadn't heard in years. "I mean, if you have time." Thomas looked at Prince George's drawing on his wall and made a decision that surprised himself. "I'll make time," he said, and meant it. After ending the call, Thomas sat in his quiet apartment and acknowledged what he had been avoiding for weeks. The young prince's gesture hadn't just been a moment of kindness. It had been a mirror reflecting back to him the cost of his absolute dedication to duty. Prince George had seen him as a complete person worthy of gratitude and respect. But Thomas had forgotten how to see himself that way. He thought about Sergeant Major Williams's warning about distraction and danger. But Thomas was beginning to believe that the real danger lay in continuing to serve without heart, going through the motions of protection while losing sight of what made life worth protecting in the first place. The next morning, as Thomas prepared for his shift, he looked at himself in the mirror with new eyes. The red tunic still fit perfectly, the brass buttons still gleamed, and the bearskin hat still commanded respect. But underneath the uniform was a man who was finally beginning to remember who he used to be, before duty became his entire identity. As he walked to his assigned position, Thomas carried with him a growing certainty that something fundamental would have to change. Prince George's silent gesture had been the beginning of his awakening, but where that awakening would lead remained unclear. What he did know was that he could no longer pretend that the increasing disconnection between his role and his humanity was sustainable. The memories came flooding back as Thomas stood at his post during what would prove to be a day of profound reflection. He remembered the young man he had been at 22, fresh out of the military and hungry for purpose. The Queen's Guard had seemed like the perfect solution, a chance to serve something greater than himself, to be part of a tradition that stretched back centuries, to find meaning in discipline and dedication. His father, a factory worker from Manchester, had been immensely proud when Thomas was accepted into the Guard. "My son, protecting the Queen herself," he would tell anyone who would listen. Thomas's mother had worried about the demands of the role, but even she had been impressed by the honor and prestige that came with the red tunic. In those early years, Thomas had thrown himself into the role with the enthusiasm of a true believer. He studied the history of the Guard, memorized every protocol, and prided himself on his ability to remain motionless for hours, regardless of weather or distraction. The uniform became more than clothing. It was armor that protected him from doubt, uncertainty, and the messy complications of ordinary life. Sarah had been attracted to that certainty when they first met. She was a nurse at a London hospital, and she found his dedication admirable, even romantic. "You're like a knight in shining armor," she would tease during their courtship. They married when Thomas was 26, and for a few years the arrangement worked. Sarah understood the demands of his job, and Thomas believed he had found the perfect balance between duty and personal life. But children changed everything. When Michael was born, Thomas discovered that love was not something that could be scheduled around shift rotations. The baby didn't care about ceremonial obligations or the importance of maintaining protocol. Michael needed his father's presence, not just his provision. And slowly, inevitably, the demands of the Guard began to eclipse Thomas's ability to be fully present for his family. Sarah had tried to make it work. She attended official functions, when spouses were invited, smiled proudly when colleagues praised Thomas's dedication, and raised Michael largely as a single parent while maintaining the fiction that they were a complete family. But by the time Michael was 10, the cracks in their marriage had become impossible to ignore. "You're married to that uniform," Sarah had said during their last serious conversation about their relationship. "I'm just someone who shares your bed when you remember to come home." The words had hurt because they contained more truth than Thomas was willing to admit. Standing at his post now, Thomas could see the progression clearly. Each promotion, each commendation, each expression of official approval had reinforced his belief that he was making the right choices. The Guard provided structure, recognition, and a clear sense of purpose that civilian life seemed to lack. When Sarah finally left, taking Michael with her, Thomas had convinced himself that their inability to understand his commitment was their failing, not his. A group of tourists approached, and Thomas watched them with new awareness. A father was explaining to his young daughter why the Guards couldn't move or speak. "They're very dedicated to their job," the man said. "They put their duty above everything else." The little girl looked puzzled. "But don't they get lonely?" she asked. The innocent question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Yes, he wanted to tell her. Yes, they get incredibly lonely. But instead, he remained silent and motionless, fulfilling his role while the child's question echoed in his mind. Later that day, Prince George appeared once more, this time clearly looking for Thomas specifically. The young prince had something in his hand, another drawing, but this one was different. Instead of showing a solitary guard, it depicted a man in civilian clothes playing football with a boy. At the bottom, in careful 11-year-old handwriting, were the words, "For when you're not on duty." George placed the new drawing near the first one's location and spoke quietly. "I asked my father about you," he said. "He told me that good. Guards protect people, but the best guards remember that they're people too." The wisdom in those words, coming from a child, was devastating in its simplicity. That evening, Thomas arranged to meet his ex-wife Sarah for coffee. It was the first time they had spoken face-to-face in over a year, and the meeting was awkward at first. Sarah looked well, perhaps happier than she had during the final years of their marriage. She was cautious but not hostile, clearly wondering what had prompted this unusual request. "I've been thinking about mistakes I've made," Thomas began, finding the words more difficult than he expected, "about choices that seemed right at the time but caused harm to people I care about." Sarah studied his face carefully. "You look different," she said. "Tired, but also more present somehow." She paused, then added, "What's brought this on?" Thomas told her about Prince George's gestures, about the drawing on his wall, about the growing realization that he had lost himself somewhere inside his dedication to duty. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to understanding. "I always wondered if you would figure it out," she said finally. "You were a good man, Thomas, but you forgot how to be a good man and a good guard at the same time." You thought they were mutually exclusive? Maybe they are, Thomas replied. Maybe that's the problem. Or maybe the problem is that you never learned how to set boundaries, Sarah suggested. You gave everything to the job and left nothing for the people who loved you. They talked for nearly 2 hours, sharing perspectives that had been impossible to communicate during the breakdown of their marriage. Sarah told him about Michael's struggles in school, about how the boy had internalized his father's absence as a personal rejection, about the gradual process of helping their son understand that Thomas's dedication to duty wasn't a reflection of his feelings for his family. He still talks about you, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. He's proud of what you do, but he's also hurt by how little room you've left for him in your life. She paused at the door of the cafe. If you're serious about change, Thomas, you need to make it real. Children don't have patience for gradual improvements. They need to see that they matter enough for you to make hard choices. Returning home that night, Thomas looked at both of Prince George's drawings with new understanding. The young prince had seen something that Thomas had been blind to, that being a good protector required maintaining connection to the things worth protecting. A guard who lost his humanity in service of duty might maintain perfect protocol, but he would eventually lose sight of why that protocol mattered. Thomas opened his laptop and began researching something he had never seriously considered before: what life might look like after the guard. There were opportunities in private security, in training, in consulting work that would use his skills without demanding his entire identity. For the first time in 20 years, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he could be both a protector and a father, both dedicated and whole. The decision crystallized on a rain-soaked Thursday morning as Thomas stood watch outside Buckingham Palace. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his bearskin hat, and his red tunic was slowly becoming heavy with moisture. But he remained perfectly still as protocol demanded. A month ago, he would have taken pride in his ability to endure the discomfort without flinching. Today, he found himself wondering why suffering in silence was considered more admirable than acknowledging basic human needs. Thomas had spent the previous week researching his options and making preliminary contacts about life after the guard. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. His skills were valuable in the private sector, but leaving would mean abandoning the identity that had defined him for 20 years. More importantly, it would mean taking a leap of faith that he could build something better for himself and his family. The conversation with Sergeant Major Williams was scheduled for that afternoon. Thomas had requested a private meeting without explaining the purpose, which had clearly made his superior uneasy. Williams was a good man who genuinely cared about the soldiers under his command, but he was also a product of the same system that had shaped Thomas's understanding of duty and sacrifice. During his lunch break, Thomas received an unexpected text message from Michael. "Made varsity football team. Thought you'd want to know?" The message was followed by a photo of his son in a red and blue uniform, holding a football and grinning broadly. Thomas stared at the image for several minutes, realizing that he was looking at a young man rather than the child he still pictured in his mind. He called Michael immediately, something that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. The conversation was brief but meaningful, with Thomas expressing genuine pride and excitement about his son's achievement. For the first time in years, he heard real joy in Michael's voice when talking to his father. "Dad," Michael said before hanging up, "would you maybe want to come to one of my games? I know you're busy, but—" "I'll be there," Thomas interrupted, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "Just tell me when and where." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Thomas wondered if the call had dropped. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Really? You promise?" "I promise," Thomas said, and meant it completely. That afternoon, Thomas knocked on Sergeant Major Williams' office door with a mixture of determination and dread. Williams looked up from his paperwork with the weary expression of a man who had seen too many difficult conversations in his career. "Come in, Mitchell. Close the door behind you." Williams gestured to the chair across from his desk. "You look like a man with something significant on his mind." Thomas took a deep breath and began with the hardest part. "Sir, I've been giving serious consideration to requesting a transfer out of the ceremonial guard." The words felt strange in his mouth. like speaking a foreign language he had only recently learned. Williams set down his pen and studied Thomas's face carefully. "That's quite a statement, Sergeant. You're one of my most reliable men. What's brought this on?" For the next 30 minutes, Thomas explained his growing realization that his dedication to the Guard had come at the cost of his relationships and his personal well-being. He spoke about Prince George's gesture and the way it had forced him to examine what he had lost in pursuit of perfect duty. Williams listened without interruption, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something that might have been relief. "You know," Williams said when Thomas finished, "you're not the first good soldier to reach this conclusion. The Guard demands everything, and for some men that works perfectly. For others, it becomes a kind of prison." He paused, looking out the window at the courtyard where other guards were practicing their drills. "I've watched you struggle with something for weeks now. I was hoping you'd work through it, but maybe working through it means finding a different path." The conversation that followed was more collaborative than Thomas had expected. Williams explained the process for requesting a transfer, the timeline involved, and the options available within the broader military structure. There were positions in training academies, in administrative roles, and in less demanding ceremonial units that would allow Thomas to maintain his career while reclaiming his personal life. "I want you to take a week to think about this," Williams said as their meeting concluded. "This is a significant decision, and I don't want you to make it in haste. If you're certain after that week, we'll begin the paperwork." That evening, Thomas attended Michael's football practice for the first time. He stood on the sidelines with other parents, feeling simultaneously proud and guilty as he watched his son demonstrate skills that had clearly developed during Thomas's absence. Michael played with confidence and natural ability, but every few minutes, his eyes would scan the sidelines to confirm that his father was still there. After practice, father and son went for dinner at a small restaurant near the school. The conversation was easier than it had been in years, with Michael sharing stories about his teammates, his classes, and his plans for the future. Thomas found himself genuinely interested in the details of his son's life, asking questions that went beyond polite parental inquiry. "You know," Michael said as they were finishing their meal, "Mom told me you might be making some changes at work." Thomas nodded carefully. "I'm considering some options. Nothing's decided yet, but I'm thinking about finding a way to have more balance in my life." "Because of me?" Michael asked, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and concern. "Because of us," Thomas corrected. "Because I've realized that being a good protector means making sure I don't lose sight of what I'm protecting." The next morning brought another encounter with Prince George that would solidify Thomas's decision. The young prince approached with a more serious demeanor than usual, his face showing the kind of thoughtful concentration that had marked their previous interactions. "I heard that some guards sometimes choose different jobs," George said quietly, positioning himself where he could speak without being overheard by passing staff. "My father said that serving can take many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to choose a different way to serve." Thomas remained at attention, but his heart was racing. The implication was clear. Somehow Prince George was aware of his internal struggle and was offering understanding rather than judgment. "I wanted you to know," the boy continued, "that if you decide to protect people in a different way, I'll understand. And I'll always remember that you stood guard for us when we needed you to." After George walked away, Thomas stood in the morning sunlight and felt the weight of his decision settling into certainty. A child had given him permission to choose his own path, to value his humanity alongside his duty. The week that Sergeant Major Williams had suggested for reflection was no longer necessary. Thomas knew what he needed to do, and for the first time in months he felt peace with his choice. The formal paperwork took 6 weeks to process, during which Thomas experienced a strange mixture of anticipation and melancholy. Each day brought him closer to leaving the role that had defined his adult life, yet each shift felt more meaningful than the last. He found himself noticing details that had become invisible through routine: the way morning light struck the castle walls, the particular rhythm of ceremonial marches, the quiet pride on the faces of fellow guards who still found complete fulfillment in their service. News of Thomas's transfer request had spread quietly through the ranks, generating reactions that ranged from puzzlement to respect. Some of the younger guards questioned his decision, unable to understand why anyone would voluntarily leave such a prestigious position. The veterans, however, showed more understanding. Several approached him privately to share their own moments of doubt, their own struggles with the balance between duty and personal life. Corporal Harrison was among those who understood completely. "I've been watching you these past months," he confided during a rare private moment. "You've been carrying something heavy and it was starting to show. Better to leave with honor than to stay until the weight breaks you." The transfer had been approved to a training position at the Royal Military Academy, where Thomas would be responsible for instructing new recruits in ceremonial protocols and discipline. It was work that would use his expertise, while allowing him a more regular schedule and the opportunity to share what he had learned about service without sacrificing everything to it. As his final week approached, Thomas made arrangements that would have been impossible under his previous schedule. He confirmed his attendance at Michael's next 3 football games, planned a weekend trip with his son to visit colleges, and even arranged to have dinner with Sarah to discuss the possibility of more collaborative co-parenting. Each commitment felt like a small victory over the isolation that had characterized his recent years. On his penultimate day, Prince George made one final appearance that would provide the perfect conclusion to their unlikely relationship. The young prince approached with an official-looking envelope in his hand, moving with the purposeful dignity that seemed natural to him despite his age. "This is for you," George said simply, offering the envelope. "It's from my father, but I asked him to write it." The envelope bore the Prince of Wales's seal, and Thomas could see his own name written in formal script across the front. Without breaking protocol, Thomas could not accept the letter directly, so George placed it carefully near his feet in the same spot where he had left his drawings weeks earlier. The young prince stepped back and, for the first time since their initial encounter, spoke loudly enough that anyone nearby could hear. "Thank you, Sergeant Mitchell, for your faithful service to our family. Your dedication has been noticed and appreciated." Then, dropping his voice to the intimate whisper they had shared throughout their interactions, he added, "I hope you find happiness in your new path." Thomas remained at attention as Prince George walked away, but inside, he felt a profound sense of completion. The relationship that had begun with a simple expression of gratitude had evolved into something that resembled friendship, despite the vast differences in their positions and ages. More importantly, it had become a catalyst for the most significant positive change in his adult life. That evening, Thomas opened Prince William's letter in the privacy of his apartment. The message was brief but deeply meaningful. "Sergeant Mitchell, my son George has spoken often about your service and the dignity with which you have carried out your duties. More significantly, he has observed in you the same struggle that many dedicated people face: the challenge of balancing service to others with care for oneself and one's family. Your decision to seek a different form of service speaks well of your character and your priorities. We wish you every success in your new role, and we hope that your example will inspire others to find sustainable ways to serve with both excellence and wisdom." The letter was signed simply, "William," and included a postscript. "George asked me to tell you that good guards protect what matters most, and that sometimes what matters most is making sure the protector doesn't disappear inside his protection." Thomas read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it beside Prince George's drawings. Together, these simple documents represented a transformation that had taken place not just in his career, but in his understanding of what it meant to live a life of service. His final day came sooner than expected, due to an administrative adjustment in scheduling. As Thomas prepared for his last shift, he felt none of the sadness he had anticipated. Instead, there was a sense of rightness about the timing, as if everything had aligned to make this transition as meaningful as possible. The ceremony marking his departure was small and traditional. Sergeant Major Williams presented him with a commendation for his years of faithful service, and his fellow guards offered the respectful acknowledgement that was customary for departing members. But the moment that mattered most came when Thomas was finally able to respond to the recognition he had received. Standing before his colleagues in civilian clothes for the first time in their presence, Thomas spoke briefly about his gratitude for the opportunity to serve, and his respect for those who would continue the tradition. But his final words were directed toward a principle that Prince George had helped him understand. True service requires not just dedication to duty, but wisdom about how to serve sustainably. The best protectors are those who remember that they too deserve protection. Protection of their relationships, their well-being, and their humanity. May you all find ways to serve with both excellence and wisdom. As Thomas walked away from the castle for the last time as a member of the Queen's Guard, he carried with him not regret for what he was leaving behind, but excitement for what he was walking toward. In his pocket were 2 drawings from a young prince, a letter from the future king, and a sense of possibility that he hadn't felt in 20 years. The red tunic was packed away, but the lessons it had taught him about discipline, dedication, and service would remain. The difference was that now he would apply those lessons in a context that honored both his commitment to something greater than himself and his responsibility to the people who loved him. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood on the sidelines of a football pitch, cheering as his son Michael scored the winning goal in the regional championship. The pride on his face was unmistakable, but it was a different kind of pride than he had felt during his years in the Guard. Warmer, more personal, and completely uncomplicated by duty or protocol. The transition to his new role at the Royal Military Academy had exceeded his expectations. Teaching young recruits about ceremonial protocols and military bearing allowed him to share his expertise while maintaining a schedule that made family life possible. His students respected his experience and responded well to his teaching style, which combined traditional discipline with a more nuanced understanding of service. "You're different," Sarah had observed during one of their co-parenting meetings that had gradually evolved into something resembling friendship. "More present, more yourself." She was right. The man who had emerged from 20 years in the Guard was recognizable as the person Thomas had been before duty consumed his identity, but with the wisdom and discipline that his service had provided. Michael had initially been cautious about his father's promises, having been disappointed too many times to trust immediately in change. But consistency had gradually rebuilt their relationship. Thomas attended every game he could, helped with college applications, and even took up golf so they could spend time together learning something new. The teenager who had once pulled away from his father's attention was now actively seeking it. "Dad," Michael said after the championship game, as they sat in their car sharing a post-game meal, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you did. Leaving the Guard, I mean. It took courage to choose us." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It took too long," he replied honestly. "But sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected teachers." He was thinking, of course, of Prince George. Thomas had followed news of the young prince from a distance, watching him grow and develop with the fascination of someone who had been touched by unexpected wisdom. The boy was thriving in his role as a future king, showing the same thoughtfulness in public appearances that he had demonstrated during their private interactions. 3 months into his new position, Thomas had received an unexpected invitation. Prince William was visiting the Royal Military Academy, and he had specifically requested to meet with Thomas during his tour. The meeting was brief but meaningful, taking place in the Academy's main office with several other staff members present. "I wanted to thank you personally," Prince William said, shaking Thomas's hand with genuine warmth. "George still talks about your conversations, and I believe they've influenced his understanding of service in positive ways. You helped teach him that good leadership requires recognizing the humanity in those who serve." The prince had paused, then added something that would stay with Thomas forever. "Your choice to step back taught him, and me, that sustainable service requires wisdom about boundaries. That's a lesson that will serve him well as he grows into his future responsibilities." Thomas's influence had indeed rippled beyond his own life. The story of his departure, while kept confidential in its details, had sparked conversations within the Guard about work-life balance and the long-term sustainability of absolute dedication to duty. Sergeant Major Williams had begun implementing small changes: mandatory time off, counseling resources, and more support for guards dealing with family issues. Several guards had approached Thomas during his visits to the academy, seeking advice about their own struggles with the demands of their role. He had become an informal mentor to those questioning how to balance service with personal fulfillment, sharing what he had learned about the importance of maintaining connections to the things that make life meaningful. The drawings that Prince George had given him remained framed on Thomas's desk at the academy, serving as daily reminders of the moment when a child's wisdom had changed the trajectory of his life. Students often asked about them, and Thomas would share the story of how recognition and gratitude from an unexpected source had helped him remember who he was beneath his uniform. On the anniversary of his departure from the Guard, Thomas received a small package with no return address but bearing the unmistakable royal seal. Inside was a photograph of Prince George at a recent public event, smiling as he spoke with a group of young people. On the back, in the prince's own handwriting, was a simple message. "Still learning from your example. Thank you for showing me that the best protectors know how to protect themselves too." That evening, Thomas sat in his modest but comfortable home, looking through photo albums that chronicled Michael's recent achievements: football trophies, academic awards, college acceptance letters. These were the moments he might have missed if Prince George hadn't reminded him that protecting what mattered most sometimes meant protecting the protector. The irony wasn't lost on him. A child had taught him to be an adult, a prince had shown him how to be human, and stepping down from his highest position had led to his greatest sense of accomplishment. The red tunic was gone, but the man who had worn it was more complete than he had ever been. As he prepared for bed, Thomas reflected on the chain of events that had begun with a simple gesture of gratitude. Prince George's recognition had planted a seed that had grown into a complete transformation of priorities and possibilities. The young prince had seen past the uniform to the person underneath and had offered the kind of acknowledgement that every human being needs but few receive. The lasting impact of that moment continued to unfold in ways both large and small. Thomas was building a stronger relationship with his son, contributing meaningfully to the training of future soldiers and living with a sense of integration that had been missing from his life for too long. More broadly, his example had inspired others to examine their own balance between service and self-care. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Prince George himself. The young prince had learned that true leadership requires seeing and valuing the humanity in others, that the best service comes from those who are whole people rather than mere functions, and that sometimes the greatest kindness is helping others remember who they are beneath their roles. Thomas fell asleep that night with a sense of gratitude that matched what Prince George had expressed months earlier. A child's silent gesture had sparked a change that rippled through lives in ways that would continue to unfold for years to come. In the end, the story wasn't just about a guard stepping down. It was about the power of human recognition to transform lives and the wisdom that can come from the most unexpected sources.